Most people know her as Mary Queen of Scots, but in reality, her name is Mary Stuart. Often back then, people were known by the name of their estate, as opposed to their real name. This story can't be told without talking about the nobles in Scotland. The noblemen acquired their lands through the kings and the queens of the country. So if anything went wrong, if their relationship with the king or the queen changed, their lands could be removed from them immediately. And so it's not like the nobles own the land, they were just assigned the land, but they will often assume the name of the land. The first page that I scanned to you talks about the chief persons of the story. The first page of this table of contents is missing. I do not know the name of the book. I probably gave it to Molly. I may find a copy of more pages later as I am going through the boxes. The point is, these 4 pages gives the names of everybody of significance in Scotland at the time Mary was queen. The 3 main countries of concern in Mary's life are Scotland, England and France. There might be some references made about Spain, but not much, because even though she courted some of the noblemen to maybe become betrothed to, there were no big things going on in this time period relating to Spain that would have been a real concern or interest, other than maybe the courtship of 1 or 2 noblemen. During Mary's time in Scotland, her life centered around the relations of Scotland, France and England. These 3 countries were all at odds with each other, and they were all trying to take over each other's country. Back then, it was about seizing new land, controlling the land that they had, and ruling their countries. Let's review the people in Mary's life. James V was Mary Stuart's father. Marie de Guise of Lorraine was Mary's mother. Mary's mother was Queen of Scotland, and ruled Scotland after Mary's father died due to injuries from a battle. Alongside each of the characters, persons in Mary's life, this list provides their birth dates and their date of death. So that's really good information. Mary's father was born in 1512, and he died in 1542. Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, was born in 1542, just a few days from when her father died. So she never knew her father. There's also James Stuart, Earl of Moray. He was an illegitimate son of James V, her father. There were many illegitimate children by the King of Scotland, as you'll see when we go through this story. Back then it was customary for the kings, before they got married, even after they got married, to have illegitimate children. They had relationships with other women, and when the women had their children they were considered bastard children outside the monarchy. Generally, these children were taken care of by the king. Their families were given money, and a lot of times they were given land. James Stuart, Earl of Moray, the illegitimate son of James V by Margaret Douglas, mistress to the king, was a half-brother to Mary Queen of Scots. He was the cause of a lot of the problems in her life. He created conflict and confusion. At times he would side with her, and then at other times he would side with the nobles. And he would disappear at times when situations became very heated. She probably realized he was doing this to her, but she just basically dealt with it. 1. Because he was a force against her since he was an illegitimate son. I think he really wanted to be king, and probably felt he should be king over her being queen. So this was the reason he caused many of the problems in her life. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was her husband, the one she married from England. He was the great-grandson of Henry VII through his mother, Lady Lennox, who was the niece of Henry VIII. So you can sort of see here how close Mary's family is to England, because the children of the monarchy would marry the children of the other monarchies. It was a custom for the monarchies to betroth their children to the children of other monarchies. Henry VIII was desperately trying to have boys to take over as King of England. It would be the natural thing to ally with the country next door in order to strengthen their territories. So there was a lot of conversation and a lot of wheeling and dealing to marry Mary into the families of England or France. Taking over Scotland was very much desired by the monarchy of England and France, so that was a primary concern for the kings and queens of these 3 countries. King Henry's objective was to take over Scotland, and betrothing his children to the monarchy of Scotland was a way to more easily take claim to the country. However, instead of an arrangement for Mary to marry the son of Henry VIII, Mary was betrothed to and married the son of the King of France at a young age. The plan was for Mary and Francis II, the French king's son, to be next in line as King and Queen of France once his parents passed away. Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart, was really like a second or third cousin to Mary, because of the way they married their children in these arranged marriages. That was normal back then. Now, let's look at James VI of Scotland, who was the son of Mary Stuart. This is the son your dad believes is the son of James Ormiston. James Ormiston and James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, which is the name of the estate, according to the genealogy chart, are like cousins through their marriages to Sinclair women. Remember when your dad was trying to do research on Sinclair? It is because James Ormiston had married, I believe, a Sinclair. There were different Sinclair families, and they had different spellings of their names. It's kind of the same thing with Ormiston. There's different variations of the spelling of Ormiston. There's even another Ormiston family that's written into a lot of these books, that really was not your James Ormiston line but a different line. However, these Ormistons were more allied and loyal to England, as opposed to Scotland, and they kind of caused some problems for James Ormiston. But James Ormiston and James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, were helpful to each other, mainly to help and protect Mary, Queen of Scots, and her mother. Her mother was a very strong woman. When Mary's father died within a week of Mary being born, Marie de Guise, Mary's mother, became Regent of Scotland and ruled Scotland until she died. This was a big responsibility for Mary's mother, because the people in Scotland were rough people. They were not genteel like they are in France. And so there was always a lot of pressure on her from the nobles, who were trying to claim more titles for themselves and more territory. She was trying to maintain peace and diplomacy. She was a Frenchwoman, so she knew how to be diplomatic and political. But she also had to deal with the rough ways of Scotland. Anyway, she relied a lot on the Ormiston men, James Ormiston and his uncle, to help her out. James Ormiston was an emissary. He would take messages back and forth between Scotland, England, and France on horseback. He was very important. He could speak Scottish, English and French. Uncle Rob was in charge of the horses for the king before the king died. And they just helped out in a lot of different ways. Transporting members of the royal family and other relations across the country, setting sail on a ship to go across the channel to France and back and forth. And, they would escort the royals wherever they needed to go all around Scotland. They were there to help out Queen Marie and her daughter Mary. There's William Maitland of Lethington. He was Secretary of State to Mary, Queen of Scots, which is like a Secretary of State for the United States. He was someone who administered the Queen's orders and handled her affairs behind the scenes. He helped with handling official matters in the country. Another diplomat that Mary used was Sir James Melville. There were other earls like the Earl of Morton, James Douglas. Most of these earls are all playing a game. They're all playing a game with the kings and the queens of their country, because they're trying to keep the lands that have been assigned to them, and to enlarge their estates. So they are trying to get more wealthy. They have their own servants, and their own militia. If there was a battle, the earls would have their own military. And they might be fighting an earl of another part of Scotland, or outside of Scotland. So they had in-country battles and out-of-country battles, and sometimes they had to unite, all of them, all their militia, to fight off England and France. So, they were separate at times, and then there are times when they were united. Also on this list of Scotland people is Matthew Stuart, Earl of Lennox, father of Darnley and chief accuser of Mary Stuart after Darnley's murder. Darnley's father had lands in Scotland and England, therefore the Lennox family was very powerful. And Mary knew that if she married this Darnley, that she would have a lot more rights to England and Scotland. So that was a political move on her part, a strategic move, and there's a lot to be said about that family. On the next page are listed the Scottish lords and lairds who sometimes supported Queen Mary and sometimes rebelled against her. They were sometimes in league and sometimes at odds, and almost all died by violence. These earls are the Earl of Argyll, Earl of Arran, Earl of Eskin, Earl of Gordon. So on and so forth. Those are some of the different Scottish lords that are part of Mary's life. They were all trying to control their estate and make impressions upon the king and queen, because if there's any change, then there's a risk of losing their land and title. These nobles and lords liked it when there was a child king or queen. There was always a big concern that a child of the royal family was going to be killed or poisoned or harmed. because then these lords would have more ability to run the country. So as long as the child was underage, the lords were more in control of the country, and they enjoyed that, and wanted to keep it that way as long as possible. When James, Mary's son, became of age, or was named king, that really was a problem for all these lords because now he was old enough, and he could really rule and be in charge of his country. That was a concern for all of the lords, and there was constant competitiveness as to who was going to have power and authority. 3. And then there's Queen Mary. Here listed are the 4 Marys that were assigned to Queen Mary at a young age as her playmates. There was Mary Beaton, Mary Fleming, Mary Livingstone, and Mary Seton that were raised with her. They were like her sisters, and also her ladies-in-waiting. They travelled with her when she was sent over to France when Mary was young, because of all the internal battling that was going on in Scotland. A few years after her father died, her mother, Marie de Guise, sent Mary to be brought up in the French court. I think Mary was only about 4 or 5 years old when her mother sent her over there, because there was a tremendous amount of concern that she was going to be killed or harmed or kidnapped while in Scotland. Mary's mother needed more protection for her daughter. These Marys were like her sisters. They were daughters of the Scottish lords, and for whatever reason they were all named Mary. I think part of the reason for that was for Mary's protection. I believe it was predetermined to name these girls Mary, because they were born around the same time as Mary, and it was known they would probably be her playmates. It was also to disguise and protect Queen Mary. There are some things that will come up later in the story where there were documents like the casket letters that were supposedly written by Mary, Queen of Scots, where she was writing about her love life and about politics and this and that. And it appears that these casket letters had been doctored, most likely by one of the other Marys. For example, there was an instance where your dad felt like one of these Marys, due to the pressure of her noble husband, made changes to some of these casket letters, to which did not put a good light on Mary, Queen of Scots. The point of this is that as these girls were growing up, they were all taught the same thing. They all learned the same handwriting style, so all their handwriting was very similar. So if later on they needed to write something on behalf of Mary, Queen of Scots, their handwriting would be so close, nobody would really know which Mary did the writing. That was something that occurred later on, where one of the Marys was used probably against her will, I would think. But she had married into one of these noble families, and the pressure was on for them to do things to stay in favour at a high level. The next person on this list is John Knox, 1505 to 1572. He is also somehow related, probably through marriage, to the Ormistons. He was a Calvinist minister, a fierce adversary of Mary Stuart. He was constantly stirring the pot, going out there and ministering to people. And he was not Catholic. He was a Calvinist. I don't know how different that is from Protestant, because James Ormiston and his uncle were Protestants. Protestants did not agree with the Catholic Church. Next is David Rizzio, who was a musician and a secretary to Mary. He came over from France. He was murdered in her presence when she was pregnant. It was because the Scottish lords were really upset about how much attention David Rizzio was getting from Mary. They wanted her attention, and she didn't want to give them her attention. She wanted to be like the French people are. French people are very loving, romantic, they like nice things, and she didn't have that kind of environment in Scotland. It was a very rugged, rough country, and there was not 4. Much genteelness going on. So Mary would relax with her friends, and the people that she knew from France. They would come over to entertain her, and the Scottish nobles were jealous of this guy. So they killed him. Mary had to be very strong through that whole period of time. It was a devastating and depressing time for Mary. She did not know who to trust. The next person on this list is Pierre de Chastelar, French poet at Mary's Scottish court. He was executed. I think he had come over from France to court Mary and was in love with her. If I recall correctly, he was found under her bed one night, and this is what led to his execution. Next is George Buchanan, 1506 to 1582, Latin master to Queen Mary, tutor to King James VI. Obviously he was important. I don't remember hearing your dad say very much about him though. Then we have all the main French characters in Mary's life while in France. Henry II was the King of France at the time that Mary went over there to be raised while in her childhood. Catherine de' Medici was his wife. There was Francis, who was their eldest son and Mary's first husband. They were betrothed at a young age. They got married when Mary was only 16 years old, I think. and I believe Francis was a little bit younger than her by a couple of years maybe, but he became ill and died at a young age, which is why Mary ended up coming back to Scotland. I think she probably would have stayed in France, but when he died, that changed everything for her in the monarchy. It's almost like they really didn't want her there. And she wanted to be queen. So she's like, well, I'm Queen of Scotland, so I'm going back to Scotland. So that's why she went back. And she went back to a very rough country. Mary could have just resigned herself to a nice cottage in the countryside in France, but she decided to go back to Scotland, and that's when all of her troubles really began. Charles IX was the second son of the King and Queen of France. Henry III was their third son. I do not think the Queen of France wanted any of her other sons to be interested in Mary. Now, let's review the main characters in England. There's Henry VII and Henry VIII. They're kind of big players. Henry VIII's second wife is the one that had Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth. And so, in actuality, Elizabeth ended up taking over as Queen of England after her mother's death, her father's death, her half-sister's death, and her half-brother's death. She's about 9 years older than Mary in Scotland. Queen Elizabeth was very jealous of Queen Mary. I think she had heard that Mary was beautiful, charming, poetic, and well-liked. Queen Elizabeth was always concerned about not being able to control her own country. She was highly sensitive to her own safety, and did not trust many people. She was therefore very political, and always trying to protect herself and England. She and Mary are actually cousins through the Henry VIII line. Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, was King of England from 1485, grandfather of Elizabeth, great-grandfather of Mary Stuart and Darnley. Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547, was son of Henry VII and King of England from 1509. Anne Boleyn, 1507 to 1536, was Henry VIII's second wife. She was executed as an adulteress. Mary I, 1516 to 1558, commonly known as Bloody Mary, was the daughter of Henry VIII by his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. She became Queen of England on the death of her brother Edward in 1553. Elizabeth, 1533 to 1603, was the daughter of Henry VIII by his second marriage to Anne Boleyn. She was declared a bastard during her father's lifetime and imprisoned by her half-sister Mary, on whose death in 1558 she became Queen of England. On the latter 1537 to 1553, was the son of Henry VIII by his third marriage with Jane Seymour. He succeeded Henry on the latter's death in 1547 and was betrothed in early childhood to Mary Stuart. James I of England and Vi of Scotland was Mary Stuart's son and Elizabeth Tudor's successor on the English throne. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, 1520 to 1598, held office successively under Protector Somerset, Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth. The last names Lord High Treasurer and Chief Minister from 1572 to 1598. Sir Francis Walsingham, 1536 to 1590, was Elizabeth's Secretary of State and Director of Espionage from 1573 onwards. William Davison, 1541–1608, was Secretary to Queen Elizabeth. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester 1532–1588, was for many years Elizabeth's closest intimate, proposed by the latter as husband of Mary Stuart. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk 1536–1572, was the Premier Peer of England, a suitor for Mary Stuart's hand, and joined in a conspiracy for her liberation, consequently executed. George Talbot, Earl of Shrewsbury 1528–1590, was for 15 years Mary Stuart's guardian, i.e. jailer. Elizabeth, Countess of Shrewsbury, Bess of Hardwicke, 1518–1608, was married to the foregoing as her fourth husband. Other attachments to this recording are genealogy chart, from James II, King of Scots d. 1460, to James VI of Scotland, and I of England, 1603. Genealogy chart, the Ormistons of Teviotdale, from Ilaf Witness in 1136, to Walter Ormiston in Graham's Law, a minor, 1564. The surnames of Scotland, the origin, meaning and history of the Ormiston name. 6. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots, page 73. A reference to James Ormiston. Partial letter from Guy G. Ormiston, continued on next recording. Outline of time schedule, MQS, James Ormiston book. Outline of chapters. Draft highlights by chapter. Recorded 8.2006.23. 7.